Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
I came across an interesting little post somewhere. It's one of those things that gets reposted along, which is the story someone told of being in therapy. And it's about how his therapist used a Nerf gun for cognitive behavioral therapy. And so basically, the way the story went, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to describe it just for copyright reasons. But basically, in therapy, his therapist said, I've got a new tool which I think is going to help you. And so out came the Nerf gun. And then the therapist went and sat down, and the guy's like, "You're going to shoot me with a Nerf gun?" And the therapist sort of conveyed, "Well, that really is up to you, isn't it?" And so then they started their therapy session, and the guy got into his talking about how I've been, letting this get to me, and then I didn't even go out. I haven't gotten myself groceries, which is such a stupid thing to do. I'm such an idiot. Whack! The Nerf pellet hit him. Pellets, the little, plastic-tipped foam dart, for those who may not be familiar with Nerf guns. And he stirred up abruptly, and then he realized that he's not supposed to describe things that way. And so then he carefully rephrased to, I'm very frustrated by this outcome, and I really want it to change. And again, I'm not quoting verbatim from it. I'm going to link the article where you can read it. And then the session goes on, and the person, it happens a bunch more times, but sort of by the end, he's starting to get this frequent correction of himself in this sort of way. Because Nerf guns don't really hurt when they hit you. Modern Nerf guns are surprisingly good for foam darts. I mean, they'll travel a good, 40, 50 feet if you don't have wind. But it wouldn't even really sting. Just sort of like get your attention quickly. And so, anyway, but through that, just sort of getting his attention, snapped to it really quickly, and then correcting, and then, trying to avoid that. He then sort of, by the end of the session, is actually feeling a little bit better. And just noting how smug the therapist seemed. And then when the next patient came in, as he was leaving, he heard someone ask, "Why are all these Nerf things on the ground?" And the therapist very seriously replied, "Cognitive behavioral therapy." And it's a good story. The reason I bring it up, actually, is because the particulars of that, what it was that the therapist was having him change, is kind of interesting. Because it's self-criticism, yes. He was admonishing the patient during self-criticism. But what's interesting about this is it's a very specific kind, because the ability to criticize yourself is an extremely important ability. In point of fact, one of the big distinctions you will find, one of the big differences you will find between successful people and unsuccessful people is that successful people can blame themselves for their mistakes, and unsuccessful people can't. Unsuccessful people always blame someone else. And then it's a self-selection bias into these two groups. Why is it that these people always blame themselves? Well, the people who can blame themselves can then fix their problems and then not have something to blame someone for, because they can then do things correctly. Whereas the other people who are always blaming someone else will never improve, because they're never actually locating the fault in the correct place. And this is why people who are complete failures always blame someone else. It's self-reinforcing. The people who only blame someone else will always be failures. You will never find somebody who is successful who always blames somebody else, for the very simple reason that if you always blame someone else, you'll never be successful. Because all success requires a constant feedback loop of trying things, seeing what you did wrong, adjusting what you're doing, and doing it better. And that actually brings me to, so what was the problem with the sort of self-criticism involved? And what's interesting is the passive nature of what the person was saying. He's calling himself an idiot. He's not saying that the action was stupid. I mean, he started by saying the action was stupid, but he moved very rapidly from that into saying that he was stupid. That is to say, he's identifying the fault not with the action, and actions are something under his control, but in himself. He's actually trying to place the fault not in his will, but in his nature. And that is something that will never lead to improvement. If you are simply defective, if you cannot do something, well, then you can't do it. And I mean, again, I like Chesterton's phrase, silly examples are always easier. Frankly, they're clearer. day-to-day examples are less clear because they're always, in real day-to-day examples, lots of different things working at the same time. Whereas you go to extreme examples, you can't relate to them, sure, but on the other hand, they're clear because they don't have all the many, many threads that work into them that real examples do. So if you bear with me on a sort of very silly but extreme example that makes the thing clear, what's the reason why I can't jump to the moon, you know? Didn't get there. Why not? What's wrong with me? Well, I can't. It's not the way it works. Muscles can't generate enough power against bones to jump to the moon from here. You won't overcome the Earth's gravity well in order to do it. It's inherently impossible. And what's the conclusion? You shouldn't try it. This should not become your life goal. Attempting to make your life better by jumping to the moon is stupid. That is to say, it is doomed to failure. And so here, if you look at it, now what's the problem? Why wasn't I able to jump to the moon? The problem is me. The problem is that I have muscles and bones, and these things cannot work to generate enough. I've got a friend who's into rocketry, so I want to say delta V. But they can't generate enough velocity in order to break out of Earth's gravity well and get to the moon. So I shouldn't try. It's a waste of time. Now, this is where the problem comes in the sort of thing that in modern Kant would be called disempowering language. But trying to place the fault in his nature rather than his will. And that is that your nature isn't something you can change. I've been over this a bunch of times, but you've got the nature you've got. You're not God, so you can't give yourself a nature. And your nature comes not from you, but from what made you. Your parents, most directly, via secondary causation. But in any event, from your parents. So, you've got what your parents gave you. And now, yeah, they gave you a lot of potential. So a lot of what you actually have at the moment is how you took advantage of the potential that you were given, but you weren't given infinite potential. You were not given the potential to jump to the moon, for example. Under your own power, yada, yada. There'll always be people who say, like, Bud, with a jetpack or bionic leg. No, I'm talking about, like, with your muscles. Now, so you can see the difference here. If the fault is in your nature, then you're being unrealistic and you're looking for happiness where it intrinsically can't be found, and you should stop that. This is something that is very true, for example, of fornication. It is not in our nature to find fulfillment and happiness in fornication. We make children that need parenting, and so you need to take care of the children that you are going to make. And moreover, that the sexual act is taking part in secondary causation and derives its real pleasure from what it is, not merely from the rubbing of a part of your body. And so, or the exposure of a part of your body you normally keep clothed, and things in between. So it is proper to a salmon, for example, to not raise its children. They spawn in the river and then they die. That's natural to it. There isn't something going wrong with the salmon because it doesn't raise its children, because its children aren't the sort of things that need to be raised, whereas human children do. And so our behavior needs to, for us to be happy, be in accordance with our nature of what we are. We are not... you can go through other examples. We're not made miserable by, it's not a problem if we don't teach our children to fly by flapping their wings, because they don't have wings. They have arms. And these things not being wings, they don't generate lift, and your children are never going to learn to fly that way anyway. So this is not a source of unhappiness for us, that we don't do that sort of thing. But if you were to try, it would become a source of unhappiness, both because you're never going to accomplish it, and you're intrinsically frustrated, and also because you're going to be leaving off the things you actually could derive happiness from. So that's why it is such a problem to locate a fault that is actually in your will, in your nature, because the proper response then is to not try to fix it, to try to do something else. And so if it is a fault in your will that you are pursuing something that you shouldn't do or leaving off something that you should do, attributing this to your nature is turning this into something that you will never try to fix. Because you shouldn't. You shouldn't try to fix it if it's part of your nature. If you really can't do calculus, you should stop wasting your time trying to do calculus. If you really can't speak French, then you shouldn't waste your time trying to learn French. And if you really can't go to the grocery store, if it's intrinsically impossible for you to go to the grocery store, if you're not the sort of creature that can go to the grocery store, you shouldn't try going to the grocery store. And so that's why this is disempowering, or in sort of more practical terminology, why this is the sort of thing that will never lead to improvement, because you're locating the fault in the wrong place. If you locate the fault rather in your will, if only I had chosen to actually go to the grocery store, you know, and again, because this is coming more to the real world, there'll be lots of things like what if, you know, you're paralyzed or whatever. That's obviously not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a healthy person who could but chose not to. There's, again, the former falls into your nature. Like if your legs don't work, then there was nothing, you know, there was no fault in your will for not trying to walk to the grocery store. You shouldn't try to walk to the grocery store if your legs don't work, etc. There are ways around it, yada yada. Real life is always complex, and you have to use your imagination to apply the principles to the specifics in order for any sort of, you know, brief discussion to work. But so this is where it's so critical to figure out is the fault in your will. I didn't actually just make myself get up and walk. And the way a lot of things work is that even though it's really hard, once you force yourself to stand up, once you force yourself to start walking, you then have some momentum you can use, and you can keep forcing yourself to keep going. And I mean, I've been there, you know, like a decade and longer ago. I was fairly depressed. It was a time in my life when I had just graduated grad school, didn't have a job, and was basically holed up in my apartment, depressed over the fact that I didn't have a job. And it became really hard to, you know, get out. But even so, when you force yourself to go act, you build up momentum and you do get things done, like going to the grocery store. And it's hard, but it's not actually true that you can't, and telling yourself that you actually can't, well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by the way, please understand, I'm not saying that willpower is the key to solving all types of depression or anything like that. What I'm saying is that being realistic is the key to dealing with one's problems. Figuring out, you know, is this problem in my will or is this problem in my nature? Because the flip mistake, attributing it to your will when it's actually in your nature, is also that sort of problem. Like, take somebody who's got a massive light sensitivity. So that going out, you know, during the day or into a place with brightly lit lights is just such an intense sensory experience for them that they can't really deal with it. Trying to locate that problem in their will rather than in the sensory overload is also going to be a problem. They're going to try to, you know, if you try to will your way through it and force yourself by force of will, you're going to wear yourself down really quickly, as opposed to doing things like being realistic and getting some thick sunglasses to be able to go to the grocery store and dealing with, yeah, I'm going to look kind of silly walking around these thick sunglasses, but like I have limitations and I just have to deal with these limitations. And there are lots of other things, like, you know, maybe it's, I can't do this thing for myself. I have to ask somebody else to do it for me because, like, it doesn't actually work. So both of those sorts of errors lead to massive problems. Locating a fault in the will when it's in your nature, or locating something in your nature when it's in your will. In order to actually improve yourself, you have to start with a realistic appraisal of what the problem actually is. And that doesn't mean it's easy to solve in either case, of course. Just should be obvious, but, you know, hey, this is the internet. So I'm not saying just because a problem is in your will means you can just, like, power your way through it, no problem, because that's not how things actually work. But it does mean that the way to fix it is by working on your will, and it may take you a very long time to overcome problems that are located in your will. But as long as, if the problem is located in your will, you are trying to address it in your will, you stand a good chance of eventually fixing this problem. If it's located in your will, but you treat it like it's in your nature, you will never solve that problem, and vice versa. So, it's just sort of an interesting kind of tangent from that fun story, but it's a very important thing when it comes to trying to be good, trying to be the perfect creature that God made you to be. And of course, everything comes, you know, God's grace is, well, in a sense, everything, since, you know, God is our being. We can only do things by the power of God's grace, but we are also supposed to cooperate in this grace and act with it as secondary causation. And so as that part of it, the only way to improve is by being realistic, by actually addressing problems where they are and not where they're not, and especially not misidentifying the sort of problem and then, you know, dealing with it as the wrong sort of problem, you know, as something to simply be dealt with and, you know, worked around rather than overcome, or something to be overcome rather than dealt with and worked around. So, hope this is interesting, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.